Morning, Zolani. If I can just do a sound check with you.
Good morning, Caroline.
How are you this morning?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Well, thank you. Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
It's Bolani.
Bolani.
Bolani, yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Can you hear me just fine, or do I need to put my headphones on?
I can hear you just fine. I'm just letting in Lebo so that we can do sound check with her. Morning, Lebo. Leboga, can you hear me?
Lebu? Yeah, Lebuga.
I see she's on mute.
I'm not, let me just, she's in the office next to me. I'm just going to give her a heads up.
Perfect.
Hi, Caroline. Sorry, my computer sound was off.
No problem. Okay, cool. As long as you're there, then I'm going to let people in. On the call is Tracy Mutsami. She's our chair of our transformation committee, and she will open the meeting, and then I'll take facilitation when she's intermittently out.
Hi, Tracy.
Good morning. How are you?
Very well, yourself?
I'm good, thank you. It's lovely to have you with us. We look forward to some very interesting conversations.
Great. I'm going to let everyone
Lovely
in.
to be with you again.
Good morning, everyone. I see it's 9:01. We're just going to perhaps give participants another minute and we will get started. Thank you. All right. Good morning, everyone. It's lovely to be here. And thank you for joining us. I'm Tracy Mutsami. I chair the Transformation Committee with SAMED. We want to welcome all of you to this morning's Transformation Forum. I can't believe it's the final one for 2021. It really is a sign that we are moving fast and furiously to the end of 2022. I am really grateful for everyone that chooses to join us on these forums. It really does help us create the momentum that we want to make transformation a dialogue that we want to have in our industry. Just a few formalities before we start. Please note that the disclaimer around conflict of interest and competition law, and we've given some guidelines around what we should do and don't. But I think the important thing is just, if you feel that there's a conflict of interest that has risen, rather excuse yourself for that time, and feel free to contact Caroline should you be unsure of that. We're recording the session, and by participating, you consent to the recording. We do welcome your questions, but due to time constraints and having a number of speakers today, we ask that you put them into the chat, raise your hand, and myself or Caroline will call on you to speak. I must apologize for today. I will not be in the forum for the entire meeting. I do have a slight conflict in my diary, but Caroline, who facilitates the process from a SAMED perspective, is very able, capable, that will be joining me and helping me to facilitate today. So in my absence, Caroline is here. We do apologize for that. I also must, I have made a special effort to try to get all the pronunciations right, and I just apologize to all of the speakers. If I do mispronounce your name, please forgive me. I am trying, and maybe that's the patience you need to have with me. That being said, I'm really excited and feel hugely positive about our first presenters for today. We want to the topic that we've chosen is thinking deeply about diversity and inclusion, and how do we truly create diverse spaces. I want to, many companies see us building sales strategies and other strategies, but we should start working on our plans for 2023 transformation strategies. And we know that our industry has not been the fastest to transform, and perhaps there's been a lack of resources and maybe just difficult times given COVID and the difficulties we've had. But to understand these truly inclusive spaces that facilitate transformation goals and go beyond triple BE spend and really give depth and create the spaces for conversations around diversity and inclusion, we are joined by two representatives from Transcend. Khaliboga is an associate director and a senior transformation facilitator with over 7 years experience in BEE advisory and enterprise and supply development consultant. She's obtained a master's degree in polymer technologies and nanobiopharmaceutics. Oh my God, even I'm impressed. And due to her educational background, she really understands business models in healthcare and is able to assist them in to start attaining return on investment. And we love the fact that she understands industry, so her engagement is really meaningful. Xolani is an associate director and a head of learning and development at Transcend Corporate Advisors. She specializes in learning and development, skills development and planning, diversity and inclusion, as well as research and thought leadership. She has over 19 years of local and international experience in research, consulting and training, and has worked with a variety of South African companies and international organizations in both the private and public sectors. Both Khaliboga and Xolani are not strangers to SAMED or strangers to us. We welcome you, and we're really looking forward to our engagement and really thoughtful discussions around diversity and transformation. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much.
Over to you. Caroline, will you bring up the presentation?
They will share their own.
Yeah, we'll share our screen. Thank you so much, Tracy. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join you at this very, very important forum, really speaking to transformation. And we truly believe that transformation and diversity and inclusion are almost chains to a link. The transformation agenda really does speak to building an inclusive South Africa. And so we'll be speaking to you around, how to build these truly inclusive spaces, but moreover, how to ensure that everybody in the business and everybody in your different networks has the necessary paradigm shifts and thinking around diversity and inclusion. Just as part of our agenda today, just to speak to what we'll be speaking to. Obviously, we've introduced ourselves. Then we will start with the global context around diversity and inclusion. We'll look at how diversity and inclusion really fits into the South African reality. We will also look at it within the healthcare and medtech sector, because it's a very important part. Health is a very important part of economic prosperity for any country. And then we'll think about how diversity and inclusion plays itself in the workplace and how we should think about it in our workplace. And then we will zoom it into what diversity and inclusion means in our sector and what it means to really be thinking around inclusive diversity within healthcare. And so just to move on, we've already introduced Xolani and myself. Just to introduce Transcend just for 1 minute, myself and Xolani are from Transcend Corporate Advisors, and what we do is we work with many companies to ensure that their transformation strategies are in line with their business values and ethos. And then Transcend Talent Management is really an executive search firm, ensuring that you find great executive talent, Black equity talent. And then Transcend Capital really assists many multinationals or many large businesses who are thinking around doing ownership transactions. So just to get into our talk, I'm going to hand over to Xolani to really speak about the global D&I context.
Thanks, Lebo. But I think before we sort of even go into the global D&I context, I think it's just worth just unpacking very briefly, high level, why diversity and inclusion is essential, why we need to be having these conversations. And I'm sure you've all heard, just in our society from a global perspective, that, corporates are sort of getting into this diversity and inclusion or D&I and agenda. So I think for the first part, just when we think about ourselves, as colleagues or as leaders, managers and business leaders and things like that, we've got to think about talent. We've got to think about our people. So it's about the diversity of talent and attracting and retaining the top talent, which we know research shows enhances employee engagement. It's also about brand reputation, right? We've seen in the past sort of couple of years and more recently, we saw one of our sort of, big stores just have these kind of missteps when it comes to speaking about diversity and inclusion or speaking about issues of transformation. We see a lot of insensitive advertising, sort of going out, So it's just about brand reputation as well, just kind of keeping D&I top of mind. It's about serving your markets better, getting to know your market and how diverse it is, your stakeholders, and just serving them better. It's also about innovation and productivity. Research shows that companies that are more diverse tend to outperform their peers, that are not as diverse. There's a legislative imperative when it comes to D&I. It might be whether it's compliance to the Employment Equity Act or it's compliance to BEE. Ultimately, there is a legislative imperative that is pushing us towards having more diverse organizations. But I think the inclusion part of it, you can't talk about diversity without talking about inclusion. The inclusion part of it is what makes D&I become more organic as opposed to just a compliance or tick box issue. And then finally, we've got to talk about the National Transformation Agenda. And this is very important, especially when we see what's happening around us. And we'll talk about it a little bit later, in terms of this kind of need, or the importance and significance of D&I and ensuring that we are building not just diverse organizations and diverse societies, but we are facilitating inclusivity as well. So just to get into a little bit of the global context, I think what we've seen, especially in the last couple of years, and I think in South Africa, D&I has always been top of mind because of our transformation agenda, right? But when we look globally, I think that there's become more of an urgency for corporates to become sort of D&I intelligent or D&I conscious. And we saw this kind of explode onto the global scene, right, in 2020 with the murder of George Floyd. And there were all these Black Lives Matter protests that erupted, in sort of hotspots around the world. But ultimately, the impact of that was that we saw more corporates sort of come in and start having these or driving these diversity and inclusion conversations, and they were almost forced or thrust into it. And when you look at, things like sort of the global, in the global context, right, there's this idea of the new protest. And what is that? These are protests that are erupting, and we've got the global protest tracker that's tracking it, right? These protests that are sort of almost popular protests, right, organized around a particular issue. And because of social media and our tech these days, word of it spreads so quickly, that this protest is going to happen. And so they're able to organize these huge movements, around a particular issue. But what's interesting for me is that when you look at these issues, right? So starting with Black Lives Matter, for example, it was around race. When other protests have been, significant protests have been around sort of women or gender equality, so advancing women's causes. Youth have been key participants in at least a third of all protest activities. And I take you back to, was it July of 2021, right? Where we had those riots, and it was mostly youth that were taking part in those riots. And then, of course, 30% of all significant protests have been over economic strain, right? So what does this say when you really look at it? It's around areas of race, areas, gender, age, when we talk about the youth, it's about economic or socioeconomic status. All of those are elements of diversity, right? And people are always like, but Chloe, what does this matter? What does it, why should I care? And it's ultimately because, and again, I'll touch on it later, that social or lack of social cohesion that we see is often reflected in our organizations. But we'll come back to sort of more talking about D&I principles. I think I'm going to hand over to Lebo to just take us through sort of the South African reality or the South African context.
Lebo, you're on mute.
My apologies. Really thinking about the South African context in terms of inequality, we know that currently the highest unemployment rate is amongst the youth and amongst Black Africans in our country, and that, as we've seen, has given rise to some of the social ills or some of the social protests that we've seen, as Xolani would have referenced, the pandemic, the protests happening in the pandemic, really a significant number being the youth. And so for us, the question becomes, what do we do as organizations? Because the fact of it is that when we don't have social cohesion in our society, then our business models eventually get interrupted. And I think it's a very important part to really consider. Next slide, please. Next slide, circle. And so what we're seeing is mass poverty and inequality in certain pockets of the country. But if we look over at Sandton, and we know that South Africa being the most unequal society in the world, we have Sandton having plentiness, resources, and just across the highway we have Alex. And this is where all the discourse around what inclusion means. But again, what does inclusion mean in the South African context? In the South African context, and this is really around the whole transformation agenda, the excluded, or the populations that were excluded also on an economic basis. And what happens is that affects our economic growth. So within the South African context, when we look at what inclusion means, is that we've also got to look at how to include people within the economy. Within international discourse, it tends to be around understanding the LGBTQI landscape, also thinking around, for instance, in the States, mass incarceration. But the primary aspect within our societies is really around, or within the South African context, is how can we get as many South Africans as possible included and alleviate this inequality. And so where are we now? Because of this lack of cohesion and lack of understanding of each other's realities, we have then what we see, a lot of insensitive advertising, a lot of lack of inclusion around thinking around hair, natural hair, which would have brought around the protests that we saw at Pretoria High School for Girls. Ironically, that's where I went to high school. And of course, we've seen of course we've seen protests around H&M, which came into the country having models, and none of them were of color, when in actual fact, the South African population is around 85% African, Indian, and colored people. And so that lack of understanding is what brings around the protests, the lack of understanding, and in turn will then interrupt our business models, right? We see also in clinical trials, people speaking about equity in clinical trials, right? And so that interfaces quite well within the healthcare context. So if we think about the healthcare context, we need to really think about it also almost interlinked with the economic context. And what it means for our countries internationally. So you see here, Tedros, I'm not going to try his surname, but this would be the WHO head speaking about inclusion, right? But from a vaccine perspective. So what we're seeing is that conversations around inclusion, diversity, and inclusion are also taking on an international phase, different languages being used, but it's all around making sure that there's access, particularly from a healthcare aspect. We see that also in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So if you look at this tweet, which was earlier this year, he says vaccine equity is ethical, epidemiological, and an economic imperative. If we don't end vaccine inequity, we don't end the pandemic and the economic and social turmoil it causes. Reaching 70% target is the only way. And what are they saying? Let's say a country that has the majority of its population unvaccinated next to a country that is fully vaccinated, ultimately that region will have a burden of COVID. Right, and so this was around the time speaking around the COVID-19 vaccine rollout, and that some allowance needed to be given to countries that were poorer. So this was within the international interest. So we're seeing within the healthcare context, inclusion is an important aspect. And of course, for yourselves, it's also around the concept of access, right? For in the commercial space, access is generally about ensuring that medical aid funders are able to fund our initiatives and our therapies. But what about those, for instance, that aren't, and how does it play out in the public sector? Next slide, please, Xolani. And this slide is really important to really look at how inequality affects life expectancy and therefore affects economic prosperity. So this tool is taken from Gapminder, and it shows over the years the life expectancies of different populations. The South Africa is in the blue. Well, and if you could just press the play button. And what you'll see is the pink is Japan. And what we notice is that as the population becomes a little bit wealthier or has a little bit more income, their life expectancy increases. And remember, if your life expectancy has increased, what are some of the privileges or opportunities that you've had? If you have enough income, if you're sick, you're going to go to the doctor. And so if you look at the effects of the inequality in our country, this is what we see. So the standard South African will live to about 68 years, and the standard Japanese, being one of the more equal societies, will live to about 86 years. And so we see now how inequality and also part of it, access to healthcare, affects different economies. And so another aspect, and we see through the NHI bill coming in, that healthcare and inclusion in the space in the South African reality is an important thing, and that's something I'll touch base on. But as you can see, only about 20% of the population have access to medical aid in our country, and we are 5 times more likely we're 5 times more likely in terms of having a death rate related to communicable diseases. And of course, this speaks to us and ensuring there's access to healthcare with regards to that, and understanding it as not just a business model, but a model around thinking inclusively and ensuring that everybody has access to our therapies. I'll just quickly move over to 1 or 2 slides. Really looking at inclusivity also speaks to women and children. So thinking about that, we see that in Q2 2022, looking at women, 47% of South African women were recorded as economically inactive. And if you look at the disease burdens in the next slide, the question becomes, how is that stat directly correlated to the underlying cause of death amongst females in our country? So as you can see, diabetes being an important one, cerebrovascular diseases, hypertensive diseases. And so if you look at those statistics around women having access to the economy and the disease burdens related to women, it really ensures that we need to ask ourselves, what are we doing around ensuring access? And the next slide is really, speaks to thinking around the gender wage gap, right? Where we know that men make about 26.1% more when it comes to women, when it comes to an hourly rate. And the future of our country is really thinking about the youth. So again, if you look at the access to medical aid by the different demographics in our country, we see white people as adolescents, of course, thinking of as adolescents as the future of our country, white people having more access to healthcare than Indian, colored, and Black Africans, and also understanding that Black Africans are over 70% of the population. So I'll hand over to Xolani to really start us in thinking about D&I in our workplace.
Thanks so much, Lebo. I think what Lebo has done very nicely here is set up the stage for how inequality or how unequal our society is, right? Just firstly, based on those other metrics that I touched on initially, and then looking at the space in which we work, right, which is the healthcare, in terms of this forum, which is the healthcare space. So just to go back to a point that I'd started to make is that why do we need to care about what's happening out there, about the inequality in our society? Right? This is because the first, and I always say in my sessions, when we think about D&I in our organizations, the starting point always has to be that the inequality and the lack of social cohesion that we see outside or in our society, in our country, is often mirrored in our organizations, right? We saw, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement spill onto a global stage, forcing outside, but forcing us to have conversations internally as institutions, as companies, as the private sector or public sector, wherever you're coming from, right? So the angst that people of color feel, the unsafety and the discomfort that women feel when it comes to, GBV, for example, the barriers that people with disabilities experience, the barriers to opportunities that the youth experience in this country, all of that is reflected in our organizations, right? And many of you, I'm sure, are asking, but how can this be so, Chloe? Like nobody's doing in our companies, right? But just because people aren't protesting our organizations, protesting in our companies, on our corridors, doesn't mean that that inequality is not there. And it takes some self-reflection as individuals, as leaders, and as an entity to be able to sort of start to unpack that and understand it. And I believe that what we do internally will ultimately have a ripple effect externally. Lebs, do you want to touch on our statistics?
Yeah. So looking at this, the statistics and really thinking around how this is mirrored in our organizations, we find that females only account for only 23% of top management positions in South Africa, despite them being 46% of the economically active population. So we see then underrepresentation of women in top management. And women, of course, are likely to earn up to 30% less, as we would have spoken to earlier. The one aspect that we really need to look at, and which government is trying to address, but hasn't really been, I think, addressed as exhaustively as it could have, is really around persons with disability, and the fact that they also account for a minuscule percentage of the top management positions in our organizations. Just to give you an example of really what the effect of having a woman at a top management position can best be described by Sheryl Sandberg in Lean In, when she was pregnant at Google, and of course the parking lot was absolutely full, and she had to park far off, and she was heavily pregnant, and she had to wobble along right to the parking lot, to the entrance, and she walked into Sergey's office and said, guys, we need pregnancy parking. And Sergey said, well, actually, we hadn't thought of that. And so this is, and this brings to light really the essence of why it's important to have top management positions, have a diverse people in that aspect. And the unemployment rate of PWD is in excess of 90%. Of course, we see that reflected in the codes because the cost per point for persons with disability and the skills development is 4 points for only 0.3% of your payroll. And then Africans, as we've said, which is over 70% of the population in South Africa, make 15.2% of the top management and 24% of the senior management, despite making 80%. Almost 80% of the EAP. Africans earn on average a third of what white people earn. And so that's really some of the realities that we need to look at our society and say some of the ills that we're seeing really are reflected in that lack of equality. And so what the Constitution does is that it comes in and says, listen, we may not unfairly discriminate on the basis of race, gender, pregnancy, marital status, and so forth. So national legislation must be enacted to prevent or prohibit unfair discrimination. So what the legislation brings in is this thinking around we all need to be equal. But again, we need to think deeper about being equitable. And what does it mean to be equitable? Being equitable speaks to thinking about equality to the next level and taking into account the vulnerable populations. And so as you can see, this picture here refers to equality, giving everybody giving everybody the same level of opportunities. But when we know that the playing ground hasn't been equal, we need to take it a step further and think about it from an equity standpoint. And so the legislation also helps us to...
Before you could go to the legislation, I think if I can just add one thing here as well, to just say that a lot of people ask, think equality or equity. When we talk equality and equity, they think about fairness. And I always say it's not about fairness. Inclusivity is not about fairness, because you can give everybody equal opportunity, right? Say our doors are open, everybody can apply to work here. But equity is really about understanding the specific challenges that people of certain demographics or particularly vulnerable groups. So when we talk disability, people with disabilities, for example, understanding the specific challenges that they face. So what do people need to be able to do their job at the best level of their capability, at the same level of capability as the next person? That's how we've got to think about equality versus equity. Sorry, Lips.
And then really thinking about it from an equitable standpoint, and this is where the legislation comes into play. We have the Skills Development Act, which was brought in to develop the skills of the Black South African workforce and to improve prospects of work. We have the Employment Equity Act, which aims to redress the disadvantages in employment. And then, of course, the BEE Act, which really is trying to ensure economic inclusion. And then the codes of good practice have really set the guidelines about it. But I think what's so important for us to understand is that the majority demographic in this country is African people, then which is at around 78 or so percent. Then we have colored people at around 9 or so percent, same percentage allocated to white people, and then the remainder to Indian people. So in many ways, ensuring that as many African people as possible are included in the economy is ensuring that the majority of South Africa is included in the economy, and then we can all equally bear the tax burdens. right? So the whole idea is to get everybody in. And so we also need to understand that in some ways, Black economic empowerment is all economic empowerment. And we see how the Act tries to, how some of the acts try to toggle that. According to the Employment Equity Act, white women are also designated employees, meaning that they should also be included. So it's not just Black people. We see under procurement in the codes of good practice, even white-owned businesses that are less than 10 million being able to get an EME affidavit for an EME level 4. So we really need to understand it as a return on investment for all in the end.
Cool. Thanks, Lebs. So I think what we've done in this sort of first part is well, up to now, is just set this the context, you know, sort of, we looked at the global context, we narrowed it down to the South African context, and then looked at the healthcare sector, and then looked at the what is the legislation doing about it. So when we talk diversity and inclusion in terms of figuring out what this is really about, there are 3 pillars to it, you know. I think there's the legislative compliance, so your compliance to the Employment Equity Act, or BEE, you know, which is one pillar of it. And then the other one is around structural change, which is around sort of the policies and practices, you know, that hold up our institutions or the systems in our institutions, right? And then what I think we can address today, in, you know, just briefly, is around behavioral change, right? The behavior, how we treat one another, how we lead as leaders, for example, how we treat each other as colleagues or as peers, and that redistribution of access and power. Because sometimes people think, I'm not a leader or I'm not a manager, this is not my responsibility, right? But that particular bucket is what I think individually we can have some control and influence over. All of those 3 together, I think, will contribute to an inclusive culture. But what we can speak about, what you can speak about to your colleagues, to your peers, to your teams, is also around that behavioral change and how to redistribute power and access. And again, the question is always, but what does that look like? How is that? And I think for us to be able to unpack that and understand that, we've got to sort of, I'm going to throw some concepts at you. And again, I just want to remind you, if you've got any questions or comments, please feel free to just pop them in the chat. But diversity, when we look at diversity and inclusion, diversity is the numbers game, right? The targets, what your EE targets are, what your BEE targets are, for example. But it's more than just a numbers game. It's about recognizing that people are different, right? So that's diversity. Inclusion, on the other hand, is about impact, right? And it's about intentionality. We've got to be intentional to ensure that everybody, the diverse, you know, employee or diverse staff that we have, diverse stakeholders that we have, we've got to be intentional about the inclusion part of it, how we facilitate or allow access for everyone to fully participate in all aspects of work and decision making, if we're looking at D&I in our organizations. So companies need to ensure that they instill this kind of inclusive culture, right, that makes people feel valued as individuals, that they feel valued in their difference. And it's so often we don't even realize that a lot of the time we've got these blind spots where we don't realize that people, we think, okay, we're diverse. We've got 80% Black African staff, or our businesses, I've heard our business is 80% women, you know, for example. But we've got these blind spots and we forget that diversity is also a wide spectrum, right? We've got age, gender, race, ethnicity. sexual orientation, so those are sort of the major dimensions or the major categories. And you'll find that those are the categories that will typically be addressed in legislation, whether it's EE, so the EE and the Black Economic Empowerment Act speak about race, gender, disability status, and age, when we talk about youth and youth access, right? But there's so many other things that make Lebo and I different. How our upbringing, our religion, where we grew up, those kinds of things also come into play. So I want to encourage you to think about diversity, but extend that a little bit and think about the intersectionality of our different identities, right? And a way to think about that, and I'm going to ask you to take 30 seconds to just look at this. I mean, we don't have time to sort of do a full-on activity, but just think about it for 30 seconds. I've put some examples there of like diversity, kind of different diversity dimensions. Think of one that has made you feel proud or safe and advantageous to identify with. And then think of one that has been painful or humiliating or disadvantaging to identify with, right? So just to give you some examples, something that has been advantageous for me to identify with, my education, my educational qualifications, right? I've had the opportunity to study in some great, international universities, and I know that gives me a leg up compared to somebody who wouldn't have gone to, or had such a privileged education, right? If I think of a disadvantage, maybe something that has been a disadvantage for me, being a mother. And that one is also like when I do this exercise with some of my workshops, it's always interesting being a mother. People find the greatest joy and advantage in it. But also as a working woman or a career woman, I worked for a research organization where some of our KPIs were, one of our KPIs was participating in conferences, international conferences. And once I became a mom, it became hard to get that approval. I was overlooked for attending international because everybody assumed she's a mom, she's got a young child, she's not going to want to travel. That became a disadvantage for me. I had an interesting one recently that I was telling Lebo about, and she had jaw dropped. A Nigerian participant in one of my workshops said, well, actually, people jokingly ask me if I'm a drug dealer. Right. So what does that tell you? When we look at number 2, the humiliating or disadvantaging or painful aspect of our identities, right? There's a lot of stereotyping that happens the minute you mix people who are different together. And I'm seeing people put in different dimensions in the chat. So being a Black woman and your education and things like that. Absolutely. Right. Yeah. So there's a lot of stereotyping that starts happening with our identities. And I want you to keep that in mind, And when we center on one aspect, when we forget that, remember that I showed you that wheel, when we forget that intersectionality and we center on one aspect of identity, right? We stereotype. And a lot of those are the challenges that come out of having diversity in organizations or diversity in spaces. And I've got a colleague that just doesn't like these 2 pictures because he's like, they're so obvious, and they're in your face, But this is how people really experience stereotypes. Have worked with lots of Muslim people who say they hate traveling to the United States, especially, because just getting through immigration and they're asked like 30,000 questions and implied that they're terrorists, Black men, on the other hand, my brother came to visit me he lives in the States, and he came a couple of years ago and he was jogging in the streets and he's like, I've forgotten how this country can be, because every time he said that as he was jogging, every time he came across a woman jogging in the opposite, she'd cross the road. Right? So there's a stereotype as well that we put on Black males, that they're going to hijack me, they're going to rape me, they're gangsters, So these are the realities that people live with. And I want to show you how dangerous or how stereotypes become dangerous, right? So stereotypes are beliefs that certain attributes or characteristics, are typical of a member or of members of a particular group. So Black men are gangsters, right? So those beliefs that we hold, they lead to bias, what we call unconscious bias. These are the value judgments that we subsequently make because of the stereotypes that we hold. And the minute that we sort of hold these value judgments, we start having these prejudices, right? Prejudices in turn lead to discrimination. So when we act on our bias, we act on our prejudice, then we engage in either sexism, racism, tribalism. There's a beautiful study that I saw where I think it was in the United States, they sent CVs for a particular management position in a hospital, a university hospital. So they were advertising for a management position. They sent CVs, male and female, and invariably the men had a better opportunity of being selected or shortlisted for interviews. They then sent other CVs, redacted the names or any reference to gender, sent the CVs blind, and guess what? Women had an equal chance or better of being selected. What does that tell you? There's bias, right? Our stereotypes. I remember having a manager when I was young saying, and I just got married, and she said to me, I took a leap. I was like, yo, young people, and I heard you just got married, but I took a leap to hire you, even though I thought she probably is going to go off on maternity leave soon. It's bias. Think about how many women have had opportunities, been missed out on opportunities because of that bias, right? So we can't talk about inclusion without talking about privilege. And I have to touch on privilege a little bit. Having put those definitions out, let's define or unpack privilege. Privilege is unearned advantage, right? It's invisible, it's automatic. You don't even think about it. You don't think you have it. A lot of people say, I'm not privileged. I work for everything that I have. That's not the privilege that we're talking about, what you've worked and earned, but rather what's helped you get to what you've worked, where you work or how you work and what you earn, right? The fact that we've got a gender pay gap. Lebo showed those statistics. The fact that Africans earn less than white people on average. Women earn less than men. People with this, there's a privilege there that's associated with having certain characteristics. A lack of privilege, on the other hand, means that you're voiceless. People who are sort of the minority in a group tend to feel like they have to work twice as hard. And often the work is not valued equally, right? So privilege, for example, is not having to wake up at 3 a.m. just to get to your place of work by 8 a.m. because you live on the other side of the city in the township and have to rely on public transport. So how do we talk about D&I in our organizations? I think the current narratives in a lot of organizations are around sort of, I'm just conscious of time, so apologies if I'm speeding through this. The current narratives are around resistance, right? Why should we care? There's deflection as well. You saw that classic example in the Black Lives Matter movement with the counter, all lives matter. There's defensiveness. We're not racist. 80% of our staff is Black or they're women. There's fear. People don't want to be accused of being racist. They don't want to be accused, on the other hand, of playing the race card if they're Black. They don't want to accuse of playing the gender card. There's fear. There's compliance, right? But what we're looking for is that commitment in narrative about D&I. Let's build it into our business strategy. So I'm inviting you to think about your D&I narrative in your organizations, right? How do you think about D&I? How do you talk about D&I and transformation? So these are the kind of experiences, I won't get into that, but these are the way that marginalized people experience diversity and inclusion in organizations. There's discrimination, bias, there's in-groups and out-groups, and often they're in the out-group. There's a lack of career progression, a lack of a flexible working facilities or environment, lack of compliance, microaggressions, and so forth, right? So to build on that inclusivity so that we get out of this, having this in our organizations, we've got to think about D&I as a cake, right? Diversity is the ingredients, the fact. Inclusion is the behavior, right? How we mix those ingredients together. And then equity is about access and empowerment, right? I always like to say diversity is like being invited to the party. Inclusion is actually being invited to dance. So remember we talked about privilege earlier, right? So how do we use our privilege to accelerate the inclusion part of D&I? We've got to identify the ways that we're privileged. Remember those blind spots we spoke about? Identify your blind spots. Learn what challenges are faced by people who lack certain privileges, right? And then look for opportunities to speak up and show up for those people who don't have the same privilege. So a way to do that is to reflect internally. Think about how it's benefited you, right? And then imagine someone who doesn't have that same privilege. What could you do in a professional setting or social context to help them, right? To achieve that access and to start thinking about access, right? Empowerment and access, I believe equity is a byproduct. Empowerment is a byproduct of access. We've got to think about access into the organization, access to information. Do I have all the information I need to make sound decisions in my job? Access to opportunity, right? Just entry into the organization. I gave you that example of the conference travel. Access to growth, right? Do young people, young women, young Black people, do they have mentorship and coaching? Access to leadership. Who does the CEO chat to in the break room? Who does the executive directors chat to, in the meeting rooms, right? So who's got access to leadership? And finally, access to safety and security, especially when we're talking about women, for example, or members of the LGBTQ community. So when we start thinking about these things and facilitating access and repurposing our privilege, then we start building these inclusive organizations, right? That are non-discriminatory, that are aware of their bias and check it, they're safe, they prioritize employee wellness and all of that good stuff.
I think maybe.
So I'm going to just hand over to Lebs to close up.
Okay. Thank you. Just thinking about diverse inclusion within the healthcare sector, I think, Xolani, I'd just like to go to the next slide around it, where we're seeing really, and if we can go to the slide after that, in our sector and our reality, inclusivity with regards to healthcare access, we're seeing it in the NHI bill. And if you look at, and this I got from Parliament, from the Parliament website. So it's really around access to healthcare, whether you're rich or poor, as you can see, a central funding system. I think there's a lot of conversation around whether it will work, whether it won't work, and what needs to happen for it to work. But the essence of this is really around ensuring that everybody has access to quality healthcare, rich or poor. And as you can see, this is where the law comes into play to really facilitate truly inclusive spaces. And I believe that's been the intention, given that we're in the most unequal society in the world. So really how we'd like to conclude and really think about diversity and inclusion is to really ask you to think about the behavioral change. how you'd like to go and relay the message around diversity and inclusion within the organizations and the paradigm shifts that you really need to speak to, and to really make an effort to understand the thinking behind the legislative framework around it, and then ensure that you structure it within your business model and within your societal changes. And that's really what will build those truly inclusive spaces. So we'd like to encourage you to embrace diversity and inclusion. It's more than just the right thing to do. It's crucial for human development. Continually look for ways to facilitate access and empower others. Do not shy away from the difficult conversations. And of course, with regards to healthcare and access, is that healthcare access to our therapies directly affects the health and the wealth of an economy and of people in general. So thank you so much for this space. We do apologize for going a little bit over time, but we hope that this conversation has been very helpful for you in terms of framing the conversations around diversity and inclusion in your respective organizations.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, so thank you very much to the Transcend team. Your presentation was absolutely excellent, and I'm sure we could talk about this for hours. It's one of those passionate subjects, and when people are passionate, they tend to speak for lengthy periods of time because there's so much to say about the topic. And I think what I really took away from the presentation is that everyone has a role to play at every level of business, and there's actually a risk to not implementing D&I strategies. You know, if you think to the riots in KZN, where it was an unequal balance in society led to quite violent protests, and we kind of need to take that into consideration. So again, thank you very much for the presentation with some really good thought leadership, and I'm hoping we can take some of those learnings and implement them in our companies. I would like to say if there are any questions that still want to come through from the delegates, you can just pop those into the chat and we'll either pass them along to the Transcend team, or Lebo, if you and Kolani can stay on for a little bit, you're welcome to also address those in the chat. So just for time reasons, I'll move on directly to our next topic. So for the next topic, we have a familiar face. As most of you know, SAMED partnered with YES in August of last year, and we've had a really positive and impactful relationship or partnership with YES since then. We are joined by Leanne Emery Hunter from the Youth Employment Services, and who's really been central to the relationship and supporting SAMED in terms of the partnership. Leanne is the Chief Operating Officer at YES, and today Leanne is going to provide just a short overview of the program and how companies can get up to 2 levels up on their scorecards. Welcome, Leanne, and I look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thanks, Caroline, and it's lovely to see the faces from Transcend as well. Nice to see you. I caught the tail end, and it's we've also been working quite closely with Transcend, so it's wonderful to see all the partnerships within the ecosystem. I just wanted to give everybody a little bit of an update in terms of the YES Transcend partnership. We just pull up my slides. I think, Caroline, that I have spoken to many of the members of this forum, so I'm not sure how much detail I need to go into around how YES works. I thought I'd just give a very brief overview, assuming that I think that I have spoken to this forum before, but please, if you want more detail, I'm very happy to go through in more detail as you see fit. But I mean, the speakers before me were talking about access and inclusivity, and that really is why YES exists, is in order to work with the private sector to affect broad-based change. So in South Africa, I'm sure most of you are aware that 2 in 3 South Africans under the age of 35 are currently jobless and excluded from the economy. And if you're thinking about 7.3 million people unemployed, that means that so many of our youth find themselves in this experience trap where I can't get a job without experience, and I can't get experience without a job. And so that's why Yes was founded just 3.5, nearly 4 years ago. And our mandate is to work with the private sector to try and assist in addressing the country's youth unemployment crisis by incentivizing and empowering business to create jobs for our unemployed youth. So we youth-focused and business-led, and we work with the private sector to create 12-month quality work experiences, because we know that the best way to become employable as a young person is to get a job opportunity. So recent Stats SA research is showing that you are 7 times more likely to transition into permanent employment if you have some kind of work opportunity. And we know from research that experience, a smartphone, which gives our youth access to networks and internet and social media, as well as a CV and a reference letter, which are all outputs of the YES program, makes a youth 3 times more employable. In return, if a business joins YES and they meet their targets, so you go onto our website, there's a few numbers you need to put in on our calculator, which will give you a number, and that number is based on your net profit after tax, your turnover, and your head count, and it does a calculation, and it says, you know, this is your YES target, and that's the number of youth lives you need to change in order to receive 1 level up on your BE scorecard. And if you double that number, then it's 2 levels up. So there is an incentive for businesses to join the program and create opportunities for youth that they otherwise wouldn't have. And it's more than just a level up. So it's an integrated solution which uplifts communities and integrates seamlessly into ESG strategies. Businesses can choose whether they sponsor youth jobs in their own organizations as part of their pipeline strategy. It's a great way to give youth an opportunity to test fit, to select the best youth for your organization, and then also to provide that life-changing opportunity for youth. At the moment, around 90% of our youth come from grant recipient households, and about 88% have dependents, so that ripple effect is enormous. So if you can't, or you would prefer not to host youth within your own organization, you can then sponsor youth jobs in external organizations. And YES has a turnkey solution where you can place youth in jobs in communities. For the most part, SAMED members prefer to use host partners that are in the healthcare industry. So we've got Youth Health Africa, Witkorp and Clinic, a number of HIV SA, a number of healthcare partners. So this can assist in capacitating the healthcare system if you would prefer not to place youth in your own organization. We also have jobs in technology, in education, in conservation. Whatever your ESG strategy is, we can align these life-changing opportunities for youth to your strategy, and then you have that triple impact. So to date, we've created in just under 4 years, 92,461 work opportunities for youth. And through the private sector, we received no government funding. We've achieved just over 750 BE levels up, 409 billion Rand back in salaries into communities, and around 40% of our YES youth alumni are currently employed. So we're seeing that that's double the national average, and this initiative is really changing the lives of so many young South Africans. And it's only with the support of our partners that we are able to affect this change. And we are so grateful for partners like SAMED, who have really been phenomenal in getting their members on board and in assisting us in making the program better. We obviously, being relatively young, we've looked at how we can improve our service levels to customers. So there's a number of things that we've recently embarked on. We have a smartphone that gets delivered to all youth, which contains learning content and monitoring and evaluation. And that now we've managed to get the time down to 4 weeks. We've introduced inductions and offboarding sessions. We've refined these to get the maximum effort. We've expanded our turnkey solution. We now have 33 partners that host partners or implementation partners that we can manage on behalf of clients, and these are all in high impact sectors. We have increased our M&E function, our monitoring and evaluation function. We've upweighted our call center, and we have introduced a specialized research project. We are now researching every quarter between 28,000 and 48,000 youth, which is more than the Stats SA quarterly labour force survey. And this is twofold. One is just to really try and understand the impact of the YES program and how we can ensure that we make youth as employable as possible. And it's also from a general youth employability point of view, is to try and find ways and incentives and pathways to try and make youth as employable as possible. I've spoken a little bit about the survey, and then just a little bit about SAMED and our partnership. So to date, we have 33 members, and that has created just over 1,894 jobs. And when you think about that in terms of salaries, that's over 100 million rand injected into local economies through YES youth salaries. What we're also seeing is really positive is that so many of the SAMED members are now signing on for year 2, year 3. Medtronic is signing on for their 5th program. So we're seeing that the program is really working, and we are sincerely grateful for the partners who have joined us recently, as well as those who keep supporting us year on year and provide us with that feedback in order to ensure that we are continuously improving on the program for the benefits of our clients in order to unlock more opportunities for youth. Because that's, at the end of the day, we want to unlock as many opportunities for young South Africans as possible, and we can only do that through our clients. So we're sincerely grateful for these partnerships. Of the 33 companies, 64% have already achieved their level up BEE scorecards. Those who have not are still in the process. So we're seeing that there's, it's really working from a transformation point of view, and we're giving thousands of youth this opportunity. We also have now embarked on a new project, which is an alumni project with SAMED. So we're very excited about this. And I have said to the team, while it's a pilot with SAMED, we are hoping that we can do something similar with a number of industries. We're also speaking to industries like the BPO sector, we're now called GBS, Global Business Services, etc., to try and do similar type projects. But what we're trying to do is to pilot a project of SAMED alumni. So members have mentioned to us that they potentially, from a headcount point of view, are not able to absorb youth that they know are superstars, and they would love to post the program. So we're trying to create a database of SAMED alumni for SAMED members to say, these youth have gone through the program, they've got the YES stamp, and they've got the stamp of excellence from their previous employee, to try and create a pool of talent for SAMED members, as well as to assist these youth in making them as employable as possible post the program. So this is to be piloted in February of next year, and we're working with a number of the SAMED members, so we're really grateful for this and excited. I've got a little video that we put together. Oh, sorry.
Lee, you'll just have to share with sound.
Oh dear, sorry, you know why? I've done. You've got to share with sound here.
Yes, so you just click on share and you'll
Sorry.
see there is include computer sound.
Apologies. Or something. Is that showing okay on your side, Caroline?
It is showing, Leanne. I guess it's just to get to the video now.
Sorry, there we go. Let's try this.
So the Youth Employment Service, or YES, is a non-profit that was established by the private sector, supported by the government. It's got its own government legislation, and its job is to get the most talented young people in South Africa who are unemployed and get them their first job. It was set up about 3.5 years ago. It's 100% private sector funded. It does about 2,000 to 3,000 youth jobs per month. And the end goal is that these youth spend a year in the program. So YES is very much a private sector contribution to youth employment, and it's about creating jobs that create jobs and just ensuring the best young talent can get the chance to really make an impact for South Africa.
SAMED is the voice of the South African medical technology industry. We source, gather, analyze, and share information and expertise, providing vital value to local and international medtech companies of all sizes. Our medtech industry has seen almost 8% year-on-year growth for the last few years, and that growth is predicted to continue into the future. Medical technology is of essential value to the provision of healthcare in South Africa. It enables healthcare, it ensures that patients are diagnosed, that they're treated, that they're rehabilitated, and that they're monitored.
As Medtronic, we touch all the hospitals in this country, public and private. And imagine that as an exposure for somebody who wants to start a career in healthcare. And really, that ability to really groom, shape your own and bring them in, it's rare. So those companies that are not part of YES, they're missing out on this. Anybody who had a chance to work, they have more chances of getting into a more formal employment. And we can only do what we can do as an industry and Medtronic as a company.
I want to urge all of SAMED's members and in general businesses in the healthcare sector to partner with YES, make a difference and help to transform people's lives, but also the healthcare sector in South Africa.
I just want to say a big thank you to SAMED. I think they've been a very important partner, and even though they're not the biggest partner, they are very enthusiastic. They're a very active partner. I think they're very committed to the country, to youth, and to making a difference. And I think the members of SAMED who are working with us have proven to be very good corporate citizens. You know, it's a value-adding partnership where we also want to recognize and support key members like that. So I think that's been great. And of course, it's also a challenge to all the other sectors who can do the same as SAMED and, you know, help build their industry, but also build youth for their businesses, but also to support the country as a whole going forward. So we're looking for great things to come, and we're looking at SAMED as a great case study for the future.
Caroline, you're on mute.
I am speaking on mute. Thank you, Arlene. So just to say thank you to Leanne, I think we've lost her there, but SAMED continues to be very passionate about the Youth Employment Services Program. You know, it's great for creating those opportunities for youth when we see that it's reducing at-risk youth by giving them opportunities to enter the workforce and become entrepreneurs. So we look forward to the time when many of our companies or many more of our companies are creating those work experiences for youth, and that sort of extends wider to the broader healthcare sector.
Sorry, Caroline, I'm not sure how I kicked myself out there. Apologies.
Sure. No problem, Lee. Thank you very much.
I know that I'm running out of time, but I think just one thing, if you don't mind, if I can just explain to some of the members. I know a lot of you are already members, so you understand how the program works, but maybe just a technicality that is quite exciting if you are joining YES for the first time. So in 2020, there was a clarification note and an amendment was sent out by the DTI. So normally when you join YES, the youth have to be placed in the program 8 months prior to your verification date in order for you to be able to receive your level up within that financial year. But in your first year of participation of YES, as long as the youth are employed pre your financial year end, you can receive the level up benefit in that same fiscal year. So if you are on a journey now where you're trying to get an additional level up before your financial year end, YES is a great way to be able to assist you on that journey, and you can receive the benefit quite quickly, but you would still be changing the lives of so many youth. So I think it's a win-win. And if there are any members who are looking for a first-year participation, it is a really fantastic benefit that allows you to assist on your transformation journey while creating these amazing opportunities for you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Leanne. And if anyone wants to know more about the YES program, you can either pop onto the SAMED website. We have a direct link to their page, or alternatively, you can just visit their website. I'll put the link in the chat.
Thanks, Caroline. They're also very welcome to email me directly. I can just pop my email in the chat if that's okay.
Perfect.
Super.
Great. And then for our final discussion this morning, we're going to look at the complexities of implementing enterprise and supplier development programs and how these differ for small versus large companies, and how can we connect the large medtech companies to partner with SMMEs. We are joined by Arlene Wilson-Max and Keba Lepele Matlako from the BEE Chamber. Arlene is the Stakeholder Relations Executive at the BEE Chamber. She has vast experience with ESD and manages the Skills Village in South Africa with over 71 development hubs. And these development hubs offer support to small Black-owned businesses. Keba Lepele is the Service Desk Transformation Specialist at the BEE Chamber, and he holds an MBA through Hunt International Business School in Dubai, and he has really good analytical and strategic skills in terms of transformation. So I'm going to hand over to Arlene and Keba Lepele, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Caroline. Keba, let me just check that you're online.
I am online, and greetings to you guys.
Thanks, Keba. Okay. I'm going to quickly play a short video, but before I do that, I'd like to thank SAMED for the opportunity to present to its members this morning on such an exciting topic, one that can create jobs in South Africa and really boost our GDP. So I'm going to quickly share screen. Caroline, please let me know if you can hear my sound. Okay.
Yes, thanks.
Okay, great.
EE Chamber. In 2010, The National Development Plan set a goal to increase the employment rate from 13.6 million to 24 million people by 2030. The number of individuals employed needs to increase by 9 million between now and 2030. Then BEE was introduced in 2007 to secure contributions from government and business towards economic growth, enabling inclusion of more South African citizens to address unemployment and alleviate poverty. If the National Development Plan and BEE was designed to grow the GDP and create jobs, then why has unemployment increased after their introduction? Our population has grown from 41 million in 1994 to 60 million people today. In that time, the number of employed South Africans has also grown by 6 million, from 8.9 million to 15 million, representing a growth in employment rate from 20% to 28.5%. However, the unemployment rate has increased over the same period from 22% to 32.6% because population growth has outperformed job creation by a factor of 3 times. What this means is that South Africa's population growth has outperformed the country's job creation. The distribution of unemployment remains highly racially skewed, with white unemployment sitting at only 8.8%, which is on par with France and is lower than Italy and Brazil. Whereas the South African Indian unemployment rate is 11.8, colored 25.7, and African 36.5. Making African unemployment the 7th highest in the world. The exceptionally high unemployment rates for Indian, colored, and especially African men and women is the reason for Black economic empowerment in South Africa and the reason for the objective of the BEE Act being meaningful participation in the mainstream economy for Black people. Join the BEE Chamber today to understand more about the original intent behind BEE and how you can align your business targets and plans to contribute as a good corporate citizen and to achieve a level of pride from your corporate contributions. As a member, you will access up-to-date information, support, guidance, services, software, and training to support your transformation journey.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for watching our little video, our short video. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Keba. Keba, you're welcome.
Hi, Aline, and greetings to everybody. Trust you having a great day today. Today we're talking about complexity of implementing ESD programs. I would have loved earlier, if we were on time, I would have basically after this, just take you through a bit of the most recent regulation from about 2 weeks ago that talked about the preferential procurement and how will they affect the sector. But because of the pressures of time, I'm not sure if we are allowed to go through that. Caroline, are you able to confirm that?
Yeah, I'll keep track of time. We have to end at 11. So if there is enough time, we'll give an opportunity. If not, maybe we'll have you on at a future forum. Okay, thank you for that. All right. Yes, and thank you very much. And you can call me Keba. It's short for Keba Dipile. And thank you for having us today. So the topics that I'm going to touch a bit on today will be the impact of SMEs to the economy, the enterprise and supplier development in relation to the BEE codes, the legislative journey of SMEs, a couple of statistics, touch a bit on why SME fails, and and unpack a bit of complexity in managing ESD programs. So as to round off in terms of the topics that will be covered. Just to basically come into this point, when you look at the role of SMEs or small businesses in the economy, is quite substantial. And the statistics are quite heavy around that. But if you look at SMEs create about 22% of the national income and contribute about 45% of total employment in the developing countries, and in line with the global
numbers. Over 95% of SMMEs employs around 60 to 70% of the working population. We talked about there was the presentation or the clip talked about the NDP, the National Development Plan, which basically envisaged that by 2030 SMMEs will contribute about 60 to 80% of the GDP increase. Now, this is basically quite an interesting part, and also SMMEs in South Africa envisaged to create 90% of the 11 new jobs in our country by 2030. Because that says 9, but we are now 11, but we're down to 9 in terms of the target. There's also now, as part of the country's landscape, there's about 250,000 SMMEs. And this is basically, I always say this, for me, the joke that is basically registered, but these are accounting for 28% of the formal jobs in the economy. However, this number fluctuates pretty much every single year, and the reason it fluctuates is simple. You have about 800,000 companies being registered pretty much every year. About 250,000 of them remains, active. The others are generally dormant, or the others are registered just for one project, and then from there it goes down. So the average amount that we continuously remain is the 250,000 SMMEs. But again, despite this thing, we still have all these challenges that are in the economy, and the funniest part, or the challenging part, is that the statistics around 70 of new business fail in less than 2 years of being in operation. We'll talk about a couple of those in a couple of minutes, and to say, but why is that the case? And there's a lot of reasons for that, and also the number changes based on who you talk to, depending on which business school or which your research entity. But we'll come back to that. But what is encouraging is that the BE codes can drive the investment in ESD programs, gives a lot of opportunities in SME development, encourages a lot of commercialization of products, and rewards job creation, because ideally SMMEs are the drivers of jobs in the market, because that's generally a global practice and the global impact in terms of what SMMEs do. Because when you look at big corporates, generally they look at how to basically optimize the profit for the shareholders, and ideally is to basically keep the structure lean and ensure that you optimize on all the activities. So the SMMEs plays quite a pivotal role in the growth of the economy and in the growth of job. Now, BE as a whole, what it's trying to do is trying to move or help the country to be much more inclusive, from a basically consolidated wealth creation by big corporates, and basically to diversify that wealth creation through different tools that are there. So it can be from an ownership point of view, from the management, skills development, and now in the ESD space, or enterprise and supplier development space. Now the targets that are there from procurement point of view as a tool, you can see it is trying to have, it is rewarding companies from sourcing from Black-owned businesses, and then also basically Black women-owned businesses by 12%. It's rewarding that, and the small businesses in particular. And now talking about QSE and EMEs, the cumulative value is about 30% of that target. So essentially, idea that how do we move from a concentrated type of wealth creation to a diversified wealth creation, and this can be done primarily through the inclusion of small business, which basically is a driver for economic growth and in particular for job creation. Now, according to the BE codes, the enterprise development and supply development are two separate things. So what you contribute towards a development of a supplier of an enterprise, it's referred to as a contribution, but the contribution basically has to have the objective that is very clear, and this objective is about contributing to the development, sustainability, and financial and operational independence of the beneficiary. So if you were to test your ESD project to say, does it basically meet this objective, then you will know that how effective it is. So you have to look at that development. What is it that you're doing? Is it on a sustainable, is it going to help with sustainability, on financial and operational independence for the beneficiary? If that's the case, then your contribution is basically doing what is intended to do. The same objective is quite the same in terms of supply development. The difference with the two is that enterprise development contributions is generally for companies that you don't do business with. So these are companies outside your value chain. So these are companies that you either want to develop or grow, so that at some stage they can grow to become your supplier. Whereas your supply development beneficiaries are companies that you are already doing business with. So just be clear of that, the difference between the two. And these beneficiaries, when you talk about these beneficiaries, we're talking about 51% Black-owned companies, and 51% Black-owned companies, according to the code, means that it must be at least 51% Black voting rights, 51% Black economic interest, and full points for net value. And these companies, in terms of beneficiaries, should be either QSE or EME. And I'm going to come into this and unpack it a bit. Now, here is what I was just talking about a second ago. When you talk about enterprise development, the qualifying criteria is as indicated, 51% Black-owned, QSE or EME. But for supplier development, it's basically the same, 51% Black-owned, QSE or EME within your value chain. And let me just clarify this one very, very slowly. That large enterprise is provided that at the time when you enter into a supplier development program with them, at that time they were qualifying as EMEs and QSE. But for your procurement point, you can claim them as an EME or QSE, which is what they were at the point of signing, for a maximum of 5 years. So what most companies will do will basically want to say the enterprise or the supplier development agreement can stretch up to 5 years. And in so doing, then you can claim the benefit, even if the company grows to become a large enterprise, maybe in the second or third year, then you can still claim the benefit as if as what they were at the beginning of their relationship. So most people miss these available points in terms of their preferential procurement score. So just take note of that. So in enterprise and supplier development, there are certain prescripts in terms of what qualifies and what percentage of that which qualifies can basically be claimed. So there's several areas, that basically the contributions that you offer will qualify. So if you deal with loans, loans do qualify, and what qualifies is the outstanding loan amount. Obviously, lower interest will basically be carrying much more recognition. If you look at the line in terms of percentages, what can be recognized for that particular activity that you do. So if it's a loan, if it's an interest bearing, it's basically going to be 50%. That you can claim the value of that loan or the value of the outstanding loan amount. And if it's an interest-free loan, it will be 70% that you can claim in terms of the value of the outstanding loan amount. But in terms of grant, you can claim 100%, and then this can be monetary or non-monetary. And I've seen a lot of companies here, leaving money on the table, I'm going to call it that, where you are doing something for the SMMEs or for the beneficiaries that do qualify, but you're not claiming the points. Sometimes can be giving them office space at your facilities, and that can be quantified. And you can basically say, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm offering them. Sometimes can be petrol or the use of vehicle or tools or equipment. You can there's a way to quantify that, and that is a grant, because if it was not if it wasn't because of what you were offering, then the company would have had to go out and rent those tools or buy the tools or equipment. So just be aware of that. But any grant, or monetary or non-monetary, is claimable at 100%. Overheads obviously should be verifiable cost, or the cost to companies is claimable at 70%. And also discount. Discount is basically a contentious one. Most people get this one wrong. The discount is actually the difference between the actual price or the normal market price and the price which you basically sell to the beneficiaries. Now, this is basically should be in addition to normal business practice. So it should not be everybody else is getting a discount, so you can claim the discount. No, there should be a special type of a dispensation for the qualifying enterprises for that particular discount, and then you can claim that kind of a discount. But if it's done for everybody else, for all companies, then you cannot basically claim it as a discount. So just be aware of that. Guarantees in terms of the if you give surety and guarantees, that can be claimable at the 50% of the guarantee amount. Minority investment, if you want to invest in EMEs and QSEs, then that count. Obviously, professional services, if you employ service of a professional to assist the beneficiary, that can be claimed. One thing that most companies like doing, but is highly administratively cumbersome, is the time of employees, which is basically means that you have employees that will go to a particular entity to assist them. and then in that period, then they spend X number of hours. So what you look at, it will be how much time they spend there, and then you take the monthly salary divided by 116, and then that becomes basically the factor that you multiply by that, but only can claim 60% of that. But to prove this one, you have to have a very good record keeping processes, and you have to have your documents in order. One other aspect that is quite important in terms of supplier development is basically the early payments. So if you pay your suppliers early enough or within 15 days, then you can claim the value of the invoice multiplied by 15%. But you can only basically get a maximum of 1.5 out of the 10 points on early payments. So that's basically what it does. It helps with the cash flow issue or cash flow challenges that small businesses basically will normally face. And I'll talk about that in a bit to say how does cash flow affect small business. This is just a legislative journey for small businesses in terms of where the country has been in trying to basically have a piece of legislation that will guide or that will basically help move or improve the growth of small business in the country. So from 1995, there's been a white paper on strategy on development businesses. There's recently one that is basically currently under, I think it's under review, is basically the NESAD, the National Integrated Small Enterprise Development program that is basically currently under review. So there has been a whole lot of activities from a legislative point of view that is seeking to help basically promote the growth of small businesses. And this is basically also included also in the National Development Plan document. And then there's been a lot of, at the bottom, there's been a lot of tools or support services like Kula and Tika Fund or the SEDAs and the SAMED of this world, the EDD, the CFAS, and now the DSB, the Development Service entities. So when we have this framework of this whole bandwidth, I'm going to call it the bandwidth of legislative tools that is earmarked at supporting and promoting growing small businesses. The question is then, why do we sit at the place where we're sitting right now? Why are small businesses continuing to fail? Because there seems to be something that is happening, and the question is, but what is the problem? And this will go to at the later stage to unpack the complexities that are there. If you look in the US numbers, and then you look at about at least 80% of small businesses, they can only survive the first year. So you have 80% of failure rate in the US. In South Africa, there are two pieces of reference that I looked at. It was basically from the UWC that says 50% of small businesses fail within the 24 months and then of launch, and 80% within the 5 years of launch. But there's another document that says about just over 70% fails within the first year. And hence I said earlier, it depends who you're talking to and what type of document or access to information they had. But what is the fact is that a whole lot of small businesses fail within the first year. This is juxtaposed against, if you look at the United Kingdom, we're looking at only 20% of small business failing within the first year. But when you look at what happened in 2016, 80% was failing within the first year. So it means something has happened between 2016 and 2022 in the UK system that basically has helped that small business failure rate has dropped this much, and ideally is that what is that? I've looked at it. There's a study document that I looked at that compares the 6 areas that basically help small business to survive. It's just a bulky document. If we have some other day, I can delve into that study that looks at different markets and why small businesses and what helps small businesses to thrive. And UK is a very good case study because actually when you look at they're actually number 1 in the whole world. That basically where there's increase of 100% of over 100% of new business coming up online every single year. So that's one of the good case studies, but this requires a bit of time, and maybe at some stage we'll unpack this in a bit. But when you look at the reasons why small businesses fail, there's two thoughts. And if you look at these two areas, you have the market and institutions. That says a couple of things that we'll talk about: lack of planning, one person show, lack of proper controls, and failure to separate the business account, poor management, low bargaining power, failures, of attracting skills, and that, most businesses that made the business or entrepreneurs are much more passionate about their product and their services, but that when you have to translate that into deliverables, then it fails. So that whole notion of passion is not expertise. But when you look at the NICID document that I referred to, which is a government piece of legislation that is coming up, talking about market access becomes one of the biggest challenges. Finance access becomes the key issues. Issues about macroeconomic environment in the policy framework, it becomes one of the issues. Studying and expanding a business, skills, labor, competitiveness. And the one part that basically I looked at was the cost to regulatory compliance. For small businesses to have, a whole lot of red tape can be a bit of a challenge, and the cost thereof to navigate that as a small business can be quite, heavy, and can lead to a business failure. And in my analysis of all these reasons, I looked at the three top ones, and because I could delve into all of them, but the three top ones has to be the cash flow challenge. I've done in this year alone, I've helped about 44 SMEs to basically develop and grow, and I do a whole lot of work in terms of the need analysis, and I'll unpack in terms of where they are as a company, what are the challenges, and cash flow out of this 44 was basically the biggest challenge for all the 44 companies that I looked at, or the 44 SMEs that I looked at. So cash flow is number one for me, and based on my experience. Number two was the value proposition in relation to understanding your customer needs. And the third one was the red tape, which is basically quite what I call an incongruent approach, because how do you place so much burden on SMEs, to try and navigate through the red tape, while they have to spend more time in providing services and goods. So those are the three ones that I looked at, and I want to unpack a bit in terms of what does it mean in terms of cash flow. I did a bit of a analysis based on one entity, and looked at their numbers based on a contract that they have in terms of company that will have a 60-day payment terms. And I know most companies have that global practice of 60-day payment terms. And when you look at the SME that has to navigate through this challenge, it becomes a bit trickier, because when you look at it in the first month, there can be orders placed, and then what happens, and when orders are placed, there's a revenue expected, but an invoiced, but nothing gets to be paid in the first month. In the second month, and there's expenses, and for that first month. In the second month, the same applies. There can be orders placed. There's a revenue expected out of those orders. It gets invoiced, but nothing is paid. And when you look at by the end of the second month, this company is a small business and running at a deficit of about just about 350K. Now, if you have a small company that has that kind of deficit, and they have to run, they have expenses to incur over a month and still be able to deliver on the orders, it tells you that there is a big of a problem in terms of cash flow. Now, at month 3 is when basically the company gets paid, and still they're struggling. But when it comes to month 4, that's the thing. And month 5, then they get a biggest order that they normally will have. Now, they still are running on a super deficit, but they're expected to deliver on this. And generally, what happens is then they either go to a finance institution to try and get more money, and that's where basically that it kills down their profits. And then now this is where you start realizing that most companies are getting choked, and chance of their survival long term gets to be hampered. And it becomes a bit of a trickier situation when you look at a period, on a 6 months period. It's difficult to find a time where this company is basically a bit afloat, and there's always orders coming up that they have to fulfill, and chances are that sometimes it gets to a point where now they start struggling, and you sometimes wonder why these guys are struggling, because of essentially what is happening is that large corporations are using them as more like as a trade type of a loan, which is basically, you know, they don't have to pay for. And that's essentially what happens in practice. Now, when you look at the trends globally, 88% in the Western group account for, you know, what you call the trade credit, which is basically using your companies below you to carry your cost in, you know, before you start paying for it. So that's the challenge that we have, and it's not a South African problem, it's just generally a global problem. In Western Europe, there's a challenge that happens. You look at the global trade credit, basically, if you look at it, assess it, you know, it's about at an average of 66 days, and it increases by 10% year on year. And this is telling you that the trend is going to basically get horrible as time goes on. And in South Africa in particular, you know, we have a similar challenge here that we had in the government departments, where you know, about over 400,000 invoices worth 33.7 billion were paid late by government departments. You know, and one of the biggest culprit was the Department of Public Works. But there has been in the past financial year, there has been an improvement of 66%. So that basically ensures that at least there's a bit of, you know, just around at least 22 billion, and that is released into the economy quicker than what it ought to have been. So this is one of the challenges that we deal with. The second, what can be done is something that basically I call it, apologies for this, that, you know, reverse factoring or supplier finance can help, and you know, payment terms that can be improved, and you know, supply development or on any payment allocation that can be quite helpful. You know, so this is what can be done to help with this, but it's something that we can talk about in a bit. The other challenge is understanding of value for different companies, and it's a bit of a trickier one, where, for argument's sake, we come to your company, you want to save time, but the solution that you give to you forces you to spend more time, but you're paying us for a particular service. Let's say the example that I like using is that you give us, as a consulting agent, you give us, let's say a BE software tool. You want to basically understand your BE position, where you are. And then you say, we wanted to use a software tool that you do that. But then when you enter information into the software tool and to understand how it works, it's going to take you about, you know, an extra 4 hours and 2 hours a week to try to do that. The challenge about that is that you wanted this tool because you wanted to save time. Now, and your value lies in terms of the time, not the tool. So normally businesses get it wrong, and normally the idea of understanding value from different points of view, you know, is different, because if you understand your customer need, and if your customer need is time to process the information accurately, what is important is that you can basically give them time back, instead of giving them something that basically will take away more of their time than they ought to have. And this is basically an example that I always use. But the other example has to be with a cleaning company that cleans your services. They come to clean your facility. You know, for hygienic places and for clean places and a proper place to work from, it is a great place to have when the place is clean. However, what happens is that you pay them the money for that. The value cannot necessarily lie in the money that you pay them or the cleaning environment. The value, if they basically understand the value clearly, can be in the behavior of the people where they're cleaning, because that can be quantified, and then you can start deriving much more value out of that, or developing new products to address those challenges. These are just some of the examples that I normally use to say value can be something that is perceived differently by different people. And when you understand the customer value very well, then you understand what you're offering and how it impacts on their key need. And most companies struggle with it. The red tape is, you know, one of the areas that, for me, is one of the biggest ones, because it, you know, it creates a lot of paperwork, a lot of unnecessary regulations, the whole decision-making processes, you know, inefficient delay, you know, and unjustifiable delays. You have a whole lot of things that you have to do for you to get one thing over the line, and that takes away time from delivering service, and that basically takes away money from the small business. The reason I have to raise this is because it leads into this area of complexities of implementing SD programs, because when you look at these complexities are all based on, if you understand that these challenges that are facing small businesses are real to them, and these are one of the reasons why they fail, then you start realizing that when you start crafting and designing your ESD programs, will talk to those needs. because if you have a supplier development beneficiary and you still want to pay them on a 60-day term, you're still adding to the probability of failure, and that's a challenge. Again, it makes sense that I will say measured entity or corporates are in the business of making money and business of basically providing service to their customer. ESD program is not part of their competencies. And what will happen again is, but because it's something that is required for competitiveness from a BE point of view, it becomes a tick box exercise where I just want to get over this and get my points and then move away. That's okay. But again, also this talks to the point of there is no capacity internally to implement ESD programs because we're focusing on your core business. And again, that can basically be tantamount to throwing the money at the problems. Like, they want what, 5% or 3% of net profit after tax, give them the 3%. I don't want to know what happened to that. But that is not basically solving the problem, but that is just exacerbating. You need to have a way of monitoring where your money is going and how does it add value, or talk to your business needs as a business, because you can use it effectively that it addresses your business challenges, or even sometimes your supply challenges or supply risk challenges. So it can be used strategically to support the thing. Also, it can go with business planning challenges at EME and measured entities, because if it's not part of a core, normally there will not be a clear business planning or strategy, around the ESD programs. So it will just be, it's just additional work, just find someone to do it. And there's nothing wrong with finding someone to do it. It's just to say, just ensure that whoever you have will do a great job, because whatever they're doing, they're representing you in that process. Also, what also is quite critical is that, there's sometimes, because you're a measured entity, you put money on the table, you want to dictate what happens in that relationship and what, what the needs are. And sometimes that does not solve the problem. It actually, increase the rate of failure of that particular business. One of the areas that is not here is, this whole, perpetual training of small business people that, they get to be trained over and over again. They never graduate or qualify or grow, but they are perpetually being trained. And that can kill a business, because if you take a small business person who's core to the business away from that business for a while, what it does, what it can do, it will ensure that the person is not focusing on generating revenue for the business, but being on training that basically doesn't add value to the business. The idea is to say, how do we ensure that this person focuses their energy on growing the business? And that's basically what gets to be a bit of a challenge. Now, what we have at the chamber in terms of when we look at the ESD, we have what we call a program management process, where we look at your supplier database, we look at what's happening, we look at understanding your opportunities and limitations with the organization, and that assists with the identification of suitable suppliers or beneficiaries that can add value to your business long term, even if it's not 1 or 2 years, but we know that you're starting to grow and develop your own supplier database, and then we basically will do a need analysis to understand the beneficiary, the needs of the beneficiary, and ideally, and that will lead to developing a plan to say, and prioritizing which needs are much higher and can help improve the business quickly. And some of the issues will be the company doesn't have an accounting system. And one of the developmental plan areas or areas to respond to is to have an accounting system and to buy them an accounting system, or to get the services of an accountant to come and pay for them, which qualifies for a supply development or for enterprise development. So these are some of the things that we look at, and then these service providers, we can identify them to make sure that these are service providers that are quite competent in delivering the service to the best of the beneficiaries' needs, and ensure that the needs basically get to be met. And this whole process, we basically walk the way with the measured entity to ensure that we look what's happening, we track the progress, we report on the progress, we have regular meetings, and ensure that by the end of the period we can generate you what we call an audit pack that is going to be used for verification. In so doing, what we end up with is basically a package where you see where your money is going. We have the right expertise and skills and knowledge to basically impact the business directly, and not just through perpetual training, but through something that will help them basically to grow and develop and possibly become your supplier in the not so far future. And also ensure that when you go for your BE verification, you have the whole pack and you can have a reporting of how are the business doing ever since your impact, your intervention. And this is basically not only a good story for the economy, but it's a good story for you in terms of your company, because you can get much of PR value and out of that. And also what you're doing, you're contributing towards basically job creation in this country. So this is basically from an enterprise program management process and addressing the complexity that are there from in the small business world. This is basically our offering, and ideally, and as indicated, in the past year alone, we've helped develop, just over 44 companies through basically the ESD program management process. Normally, how do we call this one? To say 15% of your target, it will go towards the whole program, and then based on the target size, we look at the number of beneficiaries that you can have to be developed, because we go the extra mile. We will sit down with the beneficiaries, understand their challenges, and make sure what the gaps are, and basically provide the relevant intervention, not a perpetual training, and not taking them away from doing their business, but something that will enhance to make sure that they're developed basically for sustainability and for financial and operational independence. So I hope this basically will help you to understand some of the challenges and how to navigate some of these challenges in the space. Any questions?
Yes, I do see there are some questions in the chat. There was one that says support for SMEs are short-term tick box exercises. We require true integration of small businesses into the value chain of devices. So more of a statement than a question. And then follow up to that, well, another one in the chat says, if small companies don't get good discounts during procurement, there is no way they can compete with bigger competitors. No chance of improving sales. It's the chicken and the egg. Also, they don't get a chance to distribute strategic products because OEMs don't want to work with smaller businesses. Make it make sense. So I think perhaps we can just speak out, how should larger organizations kind of facilitate small business growth? So how can they do it in a way that they enable the small business, but they, also enabling themselves? So sort of the practical points.
All right. Thank you for that. The practical points is basically about understanding your value chain. That's the first point. If you understand your value chain, understand the gaps that you have in your value chain, or the limitations that you have, from a point of you have a supplier that is not really performing well, and they're quite a good supplier to you. Ideally is to understand what the challenges are, and hence basically the process includes having to conduct a needs analysis to say, what are your challenges that basically are resulting in you not providing the services or the goods at that expected quality, speed, or cost, and then come up with a developmental plan that basically will help them do that. And in that doing, start identifying basically what can be done to help this company. That's one of the ways of looking at it and how we can best approach it. So that way, and then then you can come up with a deep intervention that helps them, to be much more sustainable, and to also to provide you with a service that is basically of high quality or the best cost. So that's what you have to look at.
Absolutely. I don't see any more questions in the chat. If anyone wants to raise their hand, if they have another question, we'd be happy to let you ask a question. I don't see any others. Tracy, if you want to just close out for us.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Caroline, and thank you for the really interesting discussions. I love the discussions around value chain proposition and interrogation of the value chain. I think it's really, really critical to successful synergistic relationships. We want to thank everyone for taking the time to attend, for your valuable presentations, and really for your valuable contributions. We all walk away from these interactions very enriched and with much food for thought. We are 1 minute past 11. Again, a special thanks to our presenters. Thank you for the prep that you've done, and thank you for meaningfully engaging with us. A big thank you to Caroline, and I do apologize for being in and out of today's forum. But we look forward to engaging with you again. Please feel free to pop an email to Caroline at the SAMED office should you want to see other topics or should you have any feedback on today. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much for joining us, and we wish you a safe and fruitful day.
Thank you, Tracy, and thank you, Caroline. And yeah, thank you for having us. We look forward to further engagements. I would have loved to do the regulations part, but I'm sure we can, organize it at a later stage because it affects you directly. Yeah. Okay.
So thank you.